Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, Engaging Your Citizens and Archiving the Social Conversation, How Oregon's Department of Transportation Ensures Transparency with Social Media, brought to you by Government Technology, Emergency Management, and ArchiveSocial. I'm Harold Tuck, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This live webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your question into an Ask a Question text area next to the video window, and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. You will see a number of widgets on the bottom of the screen as well. During today's webinar, you can connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. If you are experiencing problems with your media player, you can select the preference links under the video window and choose a different media player. If you are experiencing any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the video window. Now let's move on to our presentation, and again, welcome. The Center for Digital Government is a national thought leadership organization providing award-winning publications covering best practices and the role of technology in running state and local governments. Joining me today, and I will read their bios just prior to their presentation, but as a form of introduction will be Mr. Tom Fuller, Communications Manager, Oregon Department of Transportation, and Mr. Anil Chawla, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of ArchiveSocial. This discussion we're having today is really all about what is happening with social media in the realm of the public sector. And as you look at this slide, what I would want you to really get from this is that regardless of the age group, most all of us are on social media. In fact, the baby boomer generation represents over half of this population that is using social media today. And the social media landscape is forever changing. Look at the logos here. This is just a snapshot of that landscape, and it keeps growing as we speak. So as you review and look at this slide, you will see how managing the social media content and the message for your organization is critical. So if you ask yourself, all right, what's driving this? I would say the hyperconnectivity of the internet. We could connect just anywhere we want to be. And that's something that will allow your citizens to communicate with you regardless of where they are. And then there's a critical mass. Just the sheer number of people on this planet is driving the use of social media. Over 40% of the world population today has an internet access, and we need to be prepared for that. This snapshot really represents the amount of activity that occurs every 60 seconds using social media, some form of social media. The only thing I can say to this, amazing. So what does this mean for government? And we're about to find that out. But before we do, we have the first of two poll questions. I would ask that you all read this question and answer it. And as you're doing so, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Mr. Tom Fuller, Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Tom has worked for the state of Oregon since 2001. Before joining the Oregon Department of Transportation, he served as Communications Manager for the Oregon Employment Department. Tom is a member of the Oregon E-Government Portal Advisory Board and chairs the State of Oregon's E-Governance Board, which oversees the Oregon.gov portal and the look and feel of the executive branch agencies. Tom oversaw the writing of social media guidelines for the state in 2010 and the redesign of Oregon.gov that occurred this year. Tom is the author or co-author of 5 books, including the award-winning Oregon at Work from 1859 to 2009. Tom is a web applications developer and a national speaker on content strategy for the web. Prior to joining the state service, he spent 2 decades as a television news reporter for KTVL TV in Medford and KGW TV in Portland. He has received numerous awards, including an Emmy, the National Broadcast Association for Community Affairs, and was twice given the Frank Waller Public Relations Award. And before Tom speaks, let's see what the results are. Approximately 2/3 of you believe that social media is a public record. Just over a fifth of you don't know, and 14.3% of you think it might be a record, but you don't believe you have activity worth retaining. We'll get into this in more detail, but joining me in welcoming Tom Fuller. Welcome, Tom.
Harold, thank you very much, and thanks, folks, for joining us this morning. I am excited to be able to bring some information to you just from our experience here in the state of Oregon, especially when it comes to social media presence and then kind of retaining that social media presence so that we make sure that we are in compliance with all the applicable laws. And I know that each state has a different sort of laws regarding public records, and I can talk a little bit about Oregon's law as we get moving into this. But I thought I would set the landscape a little bit for you. Just 4 years ago in Oregon, a lot of social media was really thought to be something that agencies, executive branch agencies, should not get involved in. There was a lot of mistrust, misinformation, and really lack of good information and tools that caused a lot of agencies to feel very uncomfortable moving into this sphere. At the time, some of us agencies got together and decided that we really needed to embrace this new form of communication. Especially as a communications professional, we saw the dominance of the traditional media beginning to wane and the movement of many people onto the social space. And we really felt this was a place that we needed to be, but there were some barriers. There were some barriers in terms of security, or at least the appearance of security problems, and also a lot of legal barriers that folks were raising for giving sort of permission or encouragement to be on the social media space. And so what we did from the e-governance board, which I chair, is we created a social media and YouTube assessment teams. And those were different teams that looked at what would be the possible use of social media and YouTube especially by state agencies. And that group met, and our charge was really to come up with a social media assessment report that we would present to the Oregon State Chief Information Officer and to the e-governance board. And one of the charges of the group was to decide whether there needed to be new laws, whether there needed to be new policy, or did there simply need to be guidelines. We invited representatives from our Oregon Department of Justice. We had various different executive branch agency representatives. We had our Oregon Secretary of State, which is the keeper and the archivist. Our state archivist division belongs in the Secretary of State's office. And we had a very robust discussion about various aspects of social media and their use in the state of Oregon. We looked at, for instance, security, whether the different ways that social media presence could cause a potential security problem with viruses and malware, hijacking, unauthorized mobile access, and et cetera. And for each of those, we gave the threat, the risks, and then some recommended mitigation techniques. Then secondly, we looked at employee expectations, and we also involved our state of Oregon human resources folks in this discussion because there seemed to be a lot of angst around that people are going to be out there on their personal Facebook when they're supposed to be doing state business. And so what we did was we wrote some expectations for all social media use. We referenced current state policies that were in place, and we outlined some of those, and we set the expectation that if you're going to be using social media for state business, then you are doing the work of the state. And this is kind of a bright line between that and your personal social media experience. We encouraged agencies to have their folks obtain authorization from management, that really speaking in the social media space was no different than a communications person speaking for the agency in a very public way. And then we also looked at the ramifications of using social media personally when it affects state business. And actually, I think the social media assessment is probably online if you just Google Oregon social media assessment, or if you can contact me later, I can certainly provide that for anybody that's interested. And then finally, we looked at the idea of public records, which I'll get to here in just a moment. But the assessment was presented, and then it was incorporated into social networking media guidelines. We had already written up some draft guidelines, but these kind of put it in more official form. And this guideline became permission. It became encouragement. Yes, you can be out there in social media. Here are the things you need to be careful of. Here are the things that you need to put in place beforehand. We determined that we didn't need a new state law. We didn't need new state policies. We already had those laws and systems in place. That really what we decided was that social media was just another communication channel, no different than an email, a letter, a magazine, a press release. It was a way for the government to push out information, and the difference is also interact with the public back in the social media space. And so this was really a key for agencies to be able to go out and use the space. So I was, as mentioned in the bio section, I was with the Oregon Department of Employment, and we had a number of social media sites that we were using, and I've since moved to be the communications manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what ODOT is doing in terms of social media, we use Twitter quite extensively, as you can imagine, as a transportation agency. People are interested in what roads are open, what roads are closed, what big construction projects are going on that might affect their travels. And so we have about 17,000 followers on our Twitter feed, which is Oregon DOT. And we get about, well, for instance, in October, our tweets earned about 124,000 impressions. So quite a big, for a Department of Transportation, a big player in that space. And on Facebook, we have about 3,600 followers, and we reach about an average of 14,000 people per day in terms of shares and views without likes. And if we have something that goes viral, that can go up to about 60,000 visits. We also use Flickr quite extensively, and Oregon DOT is our Flickr handle, and we get about an average of 2.5 million views per month of our Flickr photos. And then finally, YouTube, and our YouTube videos are viewed about 10,000 times per month on average, and our viewers watch an average of about 20,000 minutes of our videos a month. And we are currently developing some new tools and strategies for making that even a more powerful way for our agency to communicate with the public. Just as for instance, we recently, before all the rains began here in Oregon, we had several wildfires, and one of them was right in the middle of a highway, Highway 224 here in our area, and it closed the road down, and people couldn't understand why the state highway had been closed. And so one of our public information officers attached a GoPro camera to the front of one of our ODOT vehicles. They drove through the fire, and you could see all the burning trees across the road and the smoke everywhere, and it was an incredible visual. 56 seconds of video came out of that. We placed it on YouTube, and on the first day, it got over 10,000 views. So people really got the message through social media, this road is not one that you should drive on. So there are some really great ways that you can utilize social media channels in order to push information out. But there are also some inherent problems, and one of those is archiving. How do we save the conversations that are taking place in social media? And so at the beginning, and really up till very recently, all of our archiving was done completely manually. So I think this is what you can see here is a Twitter log that we of our Twitter messages, which is simply copied and pasted from Twitter into a Word table, and the same with our Facebook posts. So you can see it's got the date, what the conversation was, and then who did the particular posting of that. So very time-consuming, very laborious. And soon after I came on board as the communications manager, we started looking at this a little bit more in depth, and we realized that our method of manually saving the conversations on our social media pages was creating some problems. And not the least of which was the fact that we have Oregon public records law. And in Oregon, something is public unless it is specifically exempted by state law. And we do have a number of exemptions, personally identifiable information, of course, that sort of thing. But for the most part, everything is public, and things that you put on a social media space are considered to be a public document in Oregon. But the text, we could save that, but we couldn't save any of the presentation. We couldn't show how it looked on the screen, and we couldn't save any of the metadata that surrounded those conversations. We also discovered that some recent court decisions have found that that metadata, as well as the posts themselves, are part of the public record. And so if there was a public records request for a particular part of a social media conversation, we would not be able to comply with that request and be fully compliant with the law. We, as part of the social media assessment and in our social networking guidelines, we encourage a moderation policy of comments. And this is one of the biggest differences between traditional media and social media. Social media is a conversation. So you put out a post, you get people commenting back. You can actually get individual people sending you messages. So how do you moderate those? And in our guidelines and in our social media assessment report, we encouraged a moderation policy that was in line with whatever state type of content policy that you might have. We got ours from the Department of Justice here in Oregon, but I think it was actually modeled on one from another state. And it allows you, as long as you post the moderation policy, to be able to remove comments. However, once a comment has been posted, it really becomes a part of the conversation and is potentially discoverable and is potentially part of a public records request. So once we delete a comment, even if it is within our moderation policy, how do we get that back? If we did not copy that text into a manual file, we have lost it forever. So because deleted comments can be part of the public record, we became concerned that we might not be able to be compliant with the law. So as I mentioned, we can also receive private messages over social media. But once again, our manual process didn't adequately capture these messages. So all this manual archiving, it took time, and here was the big thing for us. It was often delayed. As you probably know, we have a lot of different things that we need to do. And in order to get to all those things, the task of archiving social media conversations kind of fell to the bottom, and therefore it was sometimes many months before those conversations were archived properly. So what did we do? Well, first, we looked at some early cloud solutions for archiving the social media. These included Arcovy, Smarsh, socialmedia.com, Symantec has AdvisorMail, also ZL Technologies. And at the Department of Employment, we used Arcovy, and as I understand, that's even now part of another company, that sort of thing. And we had some success with that. But when I came over here to the Department of Employment, we felt like we needed a better solution, one that could also save a lot of the metadata surrounding the social media conversations. And so we went out and looked for another solution. And what we came up with in the final analysis was ArchiveSocial. And the reason that we decided to pick them is because there was a seamless automatic backup. We didn't have to do anything, and that was very, very helpful. It captured the data in the authentic format from the social network. So we can go out and look at our archive, and it looks just like it looked on the Facebook page or YouTube comments and that sort of thing, so that we could see it in context. It also captures the comments, even the deleted ones. and it also archives direct messages as well that are sent to us. And one of the things that my social media person liked the most about it is that the archives were very easy to retrieve. And what I liked best about it as the manager was that it was extremely cost effective. I learned about ArchiveSocial first through the National Association of Government Web Professionals, which is a great association. If you're not a part of it, you can Google NAGW or go to nagw.org and find out more information about it. But that's an organization that's really on the forefront of a lot of good thinking in terms of the use of social media, and archiving solutions is just one of the things that group is interested in. So that kind of brings me to the close of my part of the presentation. And just as a full disclosure, we're not obviously being paid to do this. This is completely on our own. We just believed so much in this product after going through this long process of determining the assessment and the guidelines, and then early social media explorations, and then this whole idea of archiving and public records just hit us like a ton of bricks. What are we going to do about it? So being able to partner with a solution, and there are others out there, of course, but one like ArchiveSocial has really made our job easy, and that was the important thing. These public records requests, they don't come up every day, but when they come up, it can really cause a lot of panic if you don't have easy access to the archive information. So we're very, and ArchiveSocial was really easy to work with for us as well. We went through a procurement process just like usually every government organization needs to do, but they were the ones who were the most recommended by our team, and so we've been extremely happy with working with them so far. So that concludes my remarks at this point. Harold, I am going to throw it back to you.
Tom, thank you. Thank you. Perfect segue, too, because our next speaker is the founder and chief executive officer of ArchiveSocial, Mr. Neil Chawla. Before, as I introduce Mr. Chawla, I would like for you all to answer our second and final poll question, which is, how is your agency currently retaining records of social media? And then Neil will go over that with us. Neil Chawla is the founder and chief executive officer of ArchiveSocial, a civic tech company that specializes in archiving social media for public records requirements. ArchiveSocial partnered with the state of North Carolina and other states to launch the world's first open and interactive archive of social media. Since then, ArchiveSocial has enabled hundreds of government entities, such as the City of Salem, Washington County, and Corvallis, Oregon, to ensure long-term transparency for government social media communications. The company was selected for the prestigious Code for America Accelerator in 2013 and recognized as a 2014 Cool Vendor in Government by leading analyst firm Gartner. Welcome, Neil.
Harold, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to all of you who have taken the time out of your busy Thursday to attend this session. As Harold mentioned, we do have a poll up here on the screen, and alongside the first poll that we ran, your responses to these polls is extremely useful for me to help me really target the rest of my talk here to provide the information that hopefully will be the most helpful to you. I also want to take a moment to thank Tom Fuller for participating today. First, Tom, I really appreciate the kind words that you had to share about your experience with our company. But more than that, about two and a half years ago, I came across the Oregon Social Networking Guide that Tom and Tom's team had helped create, and really right away noticed that there was a group of folks in Oregon that were ahead of the curve in the thinking around social media, that saw the value of that platform for how it could help government, but also saw some of the hurdles that would need to be addressed. And they were very forward-thinking and putting a strategy and policy in place. And I think we're all very fortunate to have Tom involved with this conversation here today. So with that, I'm going to, in the next 2 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides so that we can see the results of this poll. And it turns out, we've got responses all across the spectrum. What's not unusual is that most of the folks here today, a little bit more than 50%, today are not doing anything in particular to retain records. I want to tell you, don't feel bad. We're going to talk about what you might consider doing after this presentation. Typically 50, 60, 70%, depending which state we're in, folks have not done anything yet to retain records. They're really relying on the networks like Facebook and Twitter to have the information, hopefully still there when they need it. So we'll talk about that in more detail. I'm very happy to hear that nearly a third of you are doing manual captures. Although I know it's painful and time-consuming, as Tom discussed, it shows that you've recognized this issue and you've taken action. So I think out of the dozens of states that I've had presentations in, Oregon, you're actually ahead of the curve here. Those of you who are in Oregon, with taking some kind of action, whether it's the manual screen captures or using one of these other automated solutions. I think it looks like more than half the audience was doing something automated. So really glad to see that. So taking those two polls into account, here are my goals for the webinar. I really want to dive into this issue. Tom's already hit the nail on the head about the law and the framework being in place in Oregon, but I want to show you what that law looks like. I also want to show you some real-life examples of both social media as a record. I know that about 15% of you said that you weren't sure that the data was worth retaining. So I want to talk to you about maybe if we looked a little bit closer, you might change your mind. I want to talk to you about what it takes for that record to be worth retaining. So share some real-life examples there. Share some real-life legal case studies so that you can understand how this is a concrete issue. And then once we establish that, I'll switch gears and talk about solutions. So my goal by the end of this presentation is that you're armed with 4 different approaches to tackling this issue. And then time permitting, I'd like to share a live demonstration of an automated archive. And Tom's been kind enough to allow me to share their archive. So we'll hopefully give you a peek at how Oregon DOT is approaching this issue today. And then, of course, please do share your questions. We are here to answer those questions and be as helpful as we can, so please use that Q&A box. So let's take a brief look at the law. Tom, again, as he said in his presentation, indicated that there has been no new legislation, and frankly, there doesn't need to be new legislation. Oregon's had the framework for transparency, for record-keeping around communications for many decades, and social media is just another government communication. And what I've brought in the slide here is this key phrase. It's regardless of physical form. That's a phrase that we see in virtually every public records law in every state in the country. And what that phrase is there to do is to say, look, this law was written a long time ago, but the way we communicate will change. It doesn't matter how you transmit it. It's what's being said that matters. So if you think about a citizen complaint or a crime tip, we know that those are valuable pieces of information. Those are typically records if they come in on a piece of paper or in an email. So if you got a crime tip in a tweet, why is it any different? Or in a private message? The form of that communication really doesn't matter. And then to reference the actual social networking guide that Tom and his team helped create, this is spelled out in clarity for Oregon with some of the text that I have here on the screen, that social media posts are public records. That means they require you to retain them. So it's very clear this has been established in the state. The bigger question is, while social media academically, hypothetically can be a record, are you creating records that are worth retaining on your social media presence? And to answer that, I'd like to share some examples of government communications across social media that I think clearly demonstrate importance that need to be retained. And I hope that you can look at these examples and tie that back to your own social media usage to think about whether or not you are creating those kinds of records. The first category, I think the most obvious and most important example of records being created comes from public safety and emergency response. I have some screenshots here. If you've got a police department or a sheriff's office and they're using social media, they're probably putting out, we've seen this across the country now, it's become very common, they're putting out information about crimes, soliciting tips from the public. We've had instances where the public will provide information that's useful on social media, whether that's hopefully not as a comment, typically as a private message, but it comes across social media. In fact, Philadelphia PD has been fairly vocal about this, and several months ago I connected with their PIO, and the PIO told me that they'd solved more than 200 crimes that they attribute purely to social media usage and the fact that they're receiving and transmitting information on these sites. And then even more apparent than that are times of emergency. We all know that social media provides perhaps the most efficient way to get information out, and then the virality of the social network will help that information spread. We've seen that time and time again with the natural disasters and crimes that have become high profile in our country. As a key example, the Boston Marathon bombings, we all saw how important that Twitter feed was from the Boston PD. When the Boston PD finally captured the terror suspect, the very first announcement that they captured him was a tweet. It wasn't a tip to a journalist. It wasn't something on their website. It wasn't a press release. It was a tweet. And you can see how important that communication was, but how also important it was to get it out to the public as fast as possible. So in your locality, you may not have a high-profile crime that's quite as high-profile, but you have disasters, you have crimes, and I'm sure if you're on social media, you want to get that information out on those channels. You're going to create records in these times that aren't recorded elsewhere because it's just the right practical thing to do is to get that information out. Now, outside of these emergency situations and law enforcement and public safety, day-to-day, every type of department and agency in government exists for really one core purpose, I believe, which is to serve the citizens. That's really the kind of the mandate of government. So we see with every agency that you have citizen feedback and you have customer service. So think about your department, your agency, what kind of customer service are you providing? What kind of feedback are you receiving? Here's an example from Texas DOT where a woman was trying to call the DOT, couldn't get through, so she started tweeting to them, and they said, well, you know, our phone lines might be a little bit busy. And she finally figured out that the phone number that was printed on the mailing was actually incorrect. And she was able to tweet to Texas DOT, inform them of this mistake, all via Twitter. So here you have this conversation where, one, she's having this problem that's communicated via Twitter, and then she also then provides feedback that's helpful to the Texas DOT. Again, only documented on social media. Is there going to be a lawsuit around this? Hopefully not, right? But you get the idea that this is happening day in and day out. And frankly, when it turns into a legal situation or a public records request, oftentimes it's the most unexpected thing. So this kind of communication that used to happen via email, used to happen in some other format, is happening on social media. And if it's happening on your social media, you need to think about record retention. And then tie it all together, the question, the next comes up as well, okay, so maybe we are creating public records, potentially on our social media, but is anybody going to ask for them? Well, here's a real-life example from Seattle PD, just from April of this year, where a citizen who was following the Twitter feeds that Seattle PD has, they have a Twitter feed for every police beat that reports the crime incidents and the police activity. The citizen was following these Twitter feeds and started to notice that occasionally the feeds were either missing information or they were skipping postings. And so the citizen actually contacted Seattle PD via Twitter, and after a few tweets back and forth said, actually, can you just give me the archives of all of your Twitter feeds? Please consider this a Public Records Act request. In other words, this citizen made a public records request for social media using social media. And again, the citizen wanted the archives because they really wanted to verify that all the information that they were expecting would be on the Twitter feeds was actually being posted. Seattle PD came back and said, okay, well, give us 3 weeks, right? And so it's a time-consuming request for them to fulfill. And what we'll talk about a little later on is how you can turn those 3 weeks into maybe 3 days, 3 hours, or 3 minutes. Now, I will say that getting a public records request directly for social media is still a rare occurrence today. We can all, I hope, see how it can become more common as expectations change over time. But that doesn't mean you're not receiving a request that includes social media. I've got a few examples here on the screen of the kinds of public records requests that our customers receive. You may recognize this phrasing: any and all documents, all reports of the incident, all emails and communications. And if you think about it, a request like this does include social media if you had any kind of social media activity or postings that would relate to that particular incident. So if you've received requests like this, or you could potentially receive requests like this, then you are receiving, then you have the potential of having to fulfill public records for social media. So I hope that makes the case to those of you who are on the fence or unsure about social media as a record worth retaining. What I also wanted to further make the point on is that this is a real important issue for government. This is one of those issues that you have to be proactive about, and if you haven't been proactive, by the time you need to do something, it's already too late. So I want to talk to you about some legal case studies so that as you start thinking about being proactive, what are some of the issues to keep in mind? Now, the first case study I have here actually deals with email, not social media specifically, but as Tom said, it doesn't matter if it's email or social media. It's government communication is communication. And really what we're going through today with social media is pretty much what we went through with email a decade or so ago, where email was this new thing. We weren't quite sure how important it was for the way we conducted business, and we weren't sure if it was a public record. Fast forward to today, it's very clear how social media is a public record, but now we're trying to figure out fast forward to today, it's very clear that email is a public record, and we're all trying to get our heads around social media as a public record, and as social media becomes more and more pervasive in our interactions with citizens, I think it'll become abundantly clear. But we can learn a lot from the case study with email because it all does really apply to social media. In this situation, the city of Shoreline, Washington, in a neighboring state there, received this public records request back in 2006. The public records request was for an email, and the city was able to provide a copy of the email, but not the original. The citizen realized they were getting the copy of the email and not the original, and they really wanted to see how the email was sent and who sent it. So they asked for the original, and they asked for all of the original metadata. Now, Tom mentioned this term metadata. If you're not familiar with it, metadata is basically data that's associated with the content. So in an email, you might have 4 or 5 sentences of content, but associated with that email is all this technical information about who sent it, when it was sent, what computer servers it went across, all the timestamps and so forth. And so the citizen wanted to see that original metadata, and the city couldn't provide it because they only had a copy of the email and not the original. The case went to the Washington Supreme Court in 2010. And the Supreme Court did rule that, yes, the metadata is part of the public record, and yes, Shoreline, you are responsible for it, and actually fined the city $100,000. The city ultimately settled the case in 2013, had to pay the plaintiff's fees, attorney fees, so it cost the city out of pocket more than $500,000, not including their own attorney's fees. Again, more than $500,000 for having a record, but not the record that's comprehensive with all the metadata. So how does this relate to social media? Well, social media is no different. In fact, a tweet that's only 126 characters in this example has more than 2,000 characters of metadata. So those of you who are taking screenshots, I know about a third of you are today, you're taking a lot of time and effort to keep these records. I'm sure it's a pain for you. And the bad news is that that's not the best record you can have because it doesn't have the metadata. It could be, could be questioned in court from the person that's your adversary. So you want to think about, it's good that you're keeping records today. It's much better than not having any record, but you want to think about a long-term strategy that protects you in a situation like this. And finally, the second case study I have here deals with social media more directly, but it actually doesn't deal with public records. This is a situation that happened in the city of Honolulu back in 2012. The Honolulu PD was receiving postings from a particular group that was an advocacy group for gun rights. And the group was posting this pro-gun commentary that the Honolulu PD decided to moderate because they felt like it was not relevant to the conversation. When they moderated that content, the pro-gun group turned around and filed a lawsuit alleging they had First Amendment freedom of speech right to express their opinion on a government forum. Now, this lawsuit did go to court. It was never actually ruled upon because earlier this year, Honolulu decided just to settle the case, changed their social media policy, settled the case, and agreed to pay about $31,000 in attorney's fees for the plaintiff. Now, this case brings to light 2 issues. One is the issue of comment moderation. Again, we touched upon this earlier with Tom's presentation. You do want to have a very clear policy for comment moderation so you don't get a situation like this. And you want to be very cautious about when you enforce that policy. You want to be able to make a clear case for why you moderated some of that content. But secondly, more relevant to archiving, is that this is a situation that took a city to court on the basis of something that they deleted. So if you're the city of Honolulu and now you're in court trying to tell your side of the story about something that you've deleted, you better hope that you've kept some record to show why you did what you did. And that's really where archiving comes into place beyond public records, is that social media can and will find its way to court, and you want to be able to tell your side of the story. Given that social media is broadcast and public, it's out there, someone else could have taken screenshots or whatever else to have a record. So it's in your best interest to have records because you want to be able to at least have the accurate information. So hopefully at this point you've seen at least some justification for why it's important to think about this issue and ideally take action. If you're doing manual screenshots today, you're ahead of the curve, but what's that next step to get you to a long-term solution? If you're not doing anything today, I highly encourage you to think about some kind of record keeping, especially if you're moderating and removing content. Again, you can take those screenshots. It is time consuming, and it'll really cover your side of social media because you know when you're deleting something to take a screenshot. You probably don't know when a citizen's going to delete something they said to you, but at least it's better than not having any kind of protection at all. But a couple things I want to caution you against. Hearing all this information, one, I really encourage you not to think about social media as a one-way platform. I hope nobody on the phone today is in a situation where you're implementing social media as a one-way communications platform. This is something that we used to hear a lot a few years ago, but it's really dwindled down because I think folks are recognizing that the purpose of social media is to be social. That's really where all the value comes from, and particularly in an emergency situation, having that network to be able to get your message out. But more importantly than that philosophy is the fact that you can't turn off the two-way. You can't turn off Facebook comments. You can't turn off private messaging. You've got to have a two-way conversation on social media if you're there. And then for those of you who are still relying on the social networks, Twitter and Facebook, we hope that the data is there for now, but there are zero guarantees. Twitter and Facebook have no obligation to your public records law. In fact, Facebook, I can share this, it's not in my slide deck, but Facebook has language on their site that talks about how if a law enforcement agency wants a record, you can issue a subpoena, but Facebook's not responsible for anything that's been deleted. So if a citizen sends you an important message about a crime tip perhaps, and they change their mind and they delete it, it's gone forever. If someone on your staff accidentally deletes something or maliciously deletes something, it's gone forever, and you've lost records that you're required to maintain by Oregon law. So what can you do? Well, what I want to do is give you a series of options, starting from the most basic to the most sophisticated. The first is manual archiving. We've actually hit on this quite a bit, which is taking screenshots, copying, and pasting. If you're not doing anything at all, I strongly encourage you to at least take screenshots when you can, especially if you're moderating content. A lot of our customers were taking a few hours a week to take screenshots proactively, but again, that does add up. They were spending 20 to 30 hours a month of their time, which obviously could be spent much more effectively. And at the end of the day, these records are not great records. They can be easily disputed. They don't have the metadata. A better option is to consider, as Tom labeled, like early cloud solutions. There are some personal backup tools out there. Backupify comes to mind. SocialSafe is another one that's not cloud-based. These are very, very low-cost, cheap tools. I believe SocialSafe is like $20 a year, where you can back up your social media. SocialSafe will back it up to your own hard drive, so it's not an ideal solution by any means, because then you then have to back up that data. But it's better than nothing. It's somewhat automated, and it's less time intensive than screenshotting. So something to consider. The real important point with this as well is that if you have any kind of non-trivial engagement with your citizens on social media, these tools are not built for government record keeping. These are consumer-oriented backup tools, very different than a government archiving solution. So being able to produce the information and make sense of it and use it is very difficult. The screenshot I'm showing you is a screenshot of a Facebook wall out of Backupify with comments and status updates. You really have a hard time piecing it all together with these solutions. Their search functionality is very basic, but it does have some kind of automated capture that could be useful to you. I'm going to skip ahead to all-in-one archiving. So this is where real archiving comes into play. I would strongly encourage you for the long term to think about real archiving. We're not the only vendor in the market. A number of vendors come from an email archiving, web page archiving background. And some of these vendors have turned into the all-in-one solution, so I would ask you to consider them. They will archive your email, your websites, and bring social media into the mix. What I would encourage you to do, though, is to understand how they're keeping the records, and some are better than others. So are they converting the data? If they're converting the data, they might be losing the metadata. Some of the vendors are built on an email archiving platform, so they chop up social media into an email format. So you lose the metadata, and it's also really difficult to put a conversation back together. It's chopped up across many different emails. So you want to consider these kinds of things if a vendor is doing all-in-one. Figure out where their strengths are, because while there is some convenience in having it all-in-one from a procurement standpoint, from a risk standpoint and the value to your organization, what you really care about is having the data you need to have and being able to produce it. And you want to make sure that these solutions fulfill those requirements. These solutions typically run from a few thousand a year to several thousand. Sometimes they have setup fees. And ultimately what I encourage you to do, and we've boiled it down from ArchiveSocial standpoint to an ideal solution for us is one that satisfies these 4 criteria as best as possible. The first is frequency. Because this data is out in the cloud, it's not under your control. You want to get that data as quickly as possible before it's lost, especially because, again, your citizens can delete anything they're saying to you at any time and you won't even know that it happened. Comprehensiveness, you want both sides of the conversation. More is better than less, especially given that this content is being broadcast out in the public. You want to have as much of the records as possible on your side so you can tell your side of the story. Think about the metadata. We do have enough case law there that shows that metadata is important. Authenticity, will these records hold up in court if needed? Ultimately, you are a government and you're doing this for legal reasons. You want a solution that you can take the records to court and prove their authenticity so that you can tell your side of the story. And then finally, context, which I think is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of an archiving solution. It's not just about storing data. It's really about being able to produce it. So can you, put a Facebook conversation back together from a Facebook conversation that happened 3 years ago that had 100 comments on it? Can you put it back together instantly so that you can produce it? Can you recreate a Twitter timeline? So that's what takes us to social media archiving. That's our particular focus as a company. What I want to mention is that there are some archives out there that we've helped create where governments have taken their open records policy and made those open records completely open. Snohomish County there in the state of Washington is a really prime example where they actually started archiving their social media more than a year ago. They made the archive open. And had the foresight that this was an important thing to do because earlier this year we had the mudslides there in the state of Washington that affected the county. They were able to use social media as a primary tool for their emergency response. They actually coined hashtag 530 slide for one of the roads, 530. And you can actually go to this open archive, access and replay that social media response. And they've received more than 40 public information requests, and when it makes sense, they're able to direct the requester straight to the social media archive. And I know we're down to just 10 minutes here. I want to make sure we've got time for questions. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I'm going to skip to the next slide here and give you a very brief demonstration because I do want to show you what it looks like to actually have an archive in place for your social media. So let me just launch the screen share real quick and give you a sneak peek at what it means to have an automated archive. So in a moment here, you should be able to see my screen. We are looking at the archive for the Oregon DOT, and I want to touch upon just a few of those key characteristics I talked about: authenticity, context. This is we can dive actually right into one of the Facebook pages for Oregon DOT, and this is all information coming straight out of an archive. It's being captured continuously throughout the day. This is content from just 2 hours ago. In most of these records in the archive, it's there. We have it forever, even if it's lost from the social network. So you can get a sense of how this is protected. And you get a sense of the context, having the photos, having the text, having the links. Coming down to this post, there's even a conversation here about some of the information that's available on tripcheck.com. And you can see in this archive, when I talk about context, I really mean being able to make sense of that communication. So this is a conversation. This is not just independent postings. So how do you replay that conversation? And we're able to do that with ArchiveSocial, but think about that when you think about your record keeping and having to produce records down the road. How will you piece it all back together? So that's some of the conversation and the context being shown there. I also want to show you what I mean by authenticity. So if we go over to Oregon's Twitter feed, for example, we can look at some of the mentions that have come in. And scrolling down, you can just see here on a particular tweet. It's not a huge tweet by any means, but we can download out the actual metadata, and we can get a sense of how much data is actually behind any given tweet. You can see that that short tweet that's probably 110 characters has all of this metadata. So having this kind of information is very comprehensive. And then furthermore, with ArchiveSocial, we will apply digital signatures to every record in the archive so that if you do have to go to court, you can literally prove this tweet as authentic and use it as electronic legal evidence. And then finally, tying it all back together with a public information request or legal discovery, being able to search that content with a powerful search engine with date range capabilities, being able to search the entire archive at once, or being able to narrow it down to just certain content, being able to create sophisticated criteria so that if you've got a problem citizen that keeps posting, being able to find all the postings from that citizen, for example. You want to look for that kind of capability. That's the kind of stuff that you won't get out of a very simple backup tool. Furthermore, I'm going to do a wildcard search here. When you do a search, if you've ever dealt with a public information request, you know that it's a needle in a haystack problem. So really being able to drill down, I've got the whole archive here, 10,000 results. Being able to drill down to specific commentary and finding photo comments from, say, May 2011. Being able to easily find the information you need, sift through this archive. And then when you find what you're looking for, let's say we found a photo comment, being able to reconstruct and replay that conversation so that you can understand it, even though it happened 3 years ago. Being able to do all of that very easily is really what we're all about in terms of helping agencies solve this problem in a cost-effective and time-efficient manner. So again, I promised I'd keep that brief. I'm going to actually close out the screen share here. My contact information, my direct phone number, my actual cell phone number is on the next slide here, and my email address. So if I can be a resource to you in any way, please do not hesitate. I'm happy to help. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Harold for our Q&A.
Neil, thank you. Very informative. And so let's just jump right into the questions right now. We have a question. Can Oregon's DOT describe the staffing resources committed to social media/citizen engagement? So, Tom?
So we have one person in our communications section that about 50% of her job is managing our social media accounts. And then we have a series of public information officers around the state in our 5 different regions, and some staff here at headquarters that all have the passwords and the account information so that they can do posting as well. So it's a part of everybody's job, but I really have about one person who spends about half their time working in social media. The other half of her job is spent doing web stuff. She's also our kind of our webmaster for the agency.
Thank you. Well, let's keep going with you, Tom, while we have some questions for you. Is the Oregon social media assessment available online? The individual who asked the question was able to find the state guidelines but could not find the assessment.
I didn't know if the assessment was online. It's within our state collaboration site. So what I'll do as a follow-up after this is I will put it at the same place where the social networking guidelines are located. I'll have our state webmaster put up the social media assessment on that same page.
Thank you. A number of you have asked, is this presentation being recorded, and will it be available online? Yes, to both. 48 hours after the conclusion of this webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording for you to be able to share with your friends and colleagues, as well as a copy of the presentation. So thank you for asking that question. So a couple of you have asked that. Another question for both of you. How are retention policies applied against the archive? Can't keep everything forever. And how do you apply litigation holds?
Harold, I'll be happy to address that from ArchiveSocial. Yeah. So from an ArchiveSocial perspective, it's a really important question. Today we will retain everything forever because of the fact that there is no disposition at the moment. We want to make sure you have the records and sort of like an effective legal hold at the moment. But we are very actively working on retention schedule support because it's something that we've been asked about many, many times from our customers. And so from our perspective, it's an absolute very important component to your archive. And it's something that we're hoping to have here in the first quarter of next year where our customers will be able to schedule the records to a particular schedule and be able to dispose on it accordingly. Now, keep in mind, if you don't schedule a record, then the default typically is to keep that record indefinitely until it is scheduled, unless you have some kind of other overarching rule that sets a max limit.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to answer it?
I was just going to say this is new territory for us, so we're looking to vendors and providers to help give us more tools to be able to do that kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Another question we have for you gentlemen while we have time. Is there any requirement to archive if you are only posting information you're already posted somewhere else, for example, on your website?
And we generally consider social media as a copy unless there's a conversation. So the original document is actually held somewhere else. In fact, web articles are generally supposed to be, the original is supposed to be kept somewhere else. If there's a conversation, however, then we rely on this archiving solution that we have in order to keep that record so that it's accessible.
Okay, thank you. Anil, you want to say anything?
Sure, yeah. I'm glad to hear about that approach from you, Tom. We've seen that guidance from NARA, National Archives at the federal level. They've actually stated that at the federal level, content, even if it's being duplicated, becomes a record, becomes a unique record if there's opportunity for comment. So when it does turn into a conversation, you're absolutely right that it's a unique conversation that's only happening on social media and needs to be retained from social media. What I'll also add to that is that the other set of circumstances, though, is that day-to-day citizen, customer feedback. If you're getting feedback from your citizens, as well as during emergencies, just the reality that we've seen time and time again now is that a government agency that's on social media needs to get the information out. Almost all cases, the information is unique and new, and it's on social media first. And so that's another area where you're going to end up creating new records that need to be retained.
Anil, we lost you for a second. Are you away from your microphone? Because the last few words were not audible.
Oh, no, I guess I just cut out there. Basically what I was trying to say is that in an emergency situation, we've seen that social media is the go-to channel for getting information out. And it's not practical in those situations to have some other source of information first before you put it on social media. You end up just putting it on social media to get the information out. So that's a clear situation where you will create records that are not replicated anywhere else.
Okay, we have time for this final question. So here we go. Does ArchiveSocial allow for cooperative contracts between several schools? The person who is asking the question is the sole communication person for an education service district, which serves 13 districts plus the ESD, which I don't know what ESD stands for, but that's what's typed. So, Anil, this may be one for you to answer or one you might want to separately follow up to the individual.
Yes, I'll touch on it briefly. It's a great question. I think it would make sense for us to connect offline to really understand your situation. I will say that we work almost exclusively now with public sector, so we do whatever it takes, whatever makes sense for a particular region or group of organizations. We recently have seen a lot of traction with school systems. It's becoming an emerging. We've seen social media usage increase quite a bit in the last year with school systems. And so, I'll give you an example. We recently did put an archive together for an entire school district in Florida. So as it makes sense, we're happy to work with you to help you solve this problem.
Great. Well, I want to be mindful of the 1-hour commitment that we said this webinar would be. I also want to especially thank the person who wrote a question, who sent a statement that said to us, gentlemen, this was a great webinar, and thank you. I want to echo that and thank Mr. Tom Fuller and Mr. Anil Chawar. I also want to especially thank our sponsors today, ArchiveSocial, Emergency Management, and Government Technology. And we look forward to seeing you at another webinar soon. Thank you for attending.